the Carnival of Nightmares. The rusty gates of the Blackwood Carnival groaned in protest as they swung open, allowing entry to the overgrown field that had once served as the parking lot. Thick weeds and brush poked through cracks in the asphalt, ensnaring discarded soda cans, tattered candy wrappers, and other debris from an era when this place had teemed with life and revelry. A cool autumn breeze whistled through the abandoned fairgrounds, setting tattered flags adorned with clearing carnival masks and lurid circus imagery undulating like ghostly apparitions. The scent of decay and neglect hung heavy in the air, a melancholy bouquet of damp earth, rotting wood, and the faint traces of musty canvas and machine grease from bygone attractions. Somewhere in the depths of this derelict carnival, the unmistakable creak of straining, rusting metal pierced the uneasy silence to echo across the desolate landscape. The haunting note was soon joined by a cacophony of groaning rides and flapping canvas, a mournful symphony beckoning the bravest souls to step beyond the threshold and into the realm where mysteries and forgotten secrets still lurked, lying in wait to ensnare the unwary. "This is it, guys. The place of legends." Jesse's hushed voice carried an awestruck tremor as he stared up at the towering, weather-beaten archway that marked the entrance to the Blackwood Carnival. 5 teenagers, Jess, Alex, Mia, Nathan, and Emma, restless souls seeking a thrill more potent than any high, had ventured deep into these forbidden grounds under the cloak of the moonless autumn night. Despite their brash bravado, a tingle of anxious anticipation laced with atavistic fear raised goosebumps on their chilled flesh. "You sure about this?" Mia asked, fingers tightly gripping the sleeve of her boyfriend Alex's weathered jacket. Her eyes were wide, shining with worry in the dim glow of the flashlights. "I've heard some really messed up stories about this place." Jesse flashed a daring grin that betrayed none of his inner trepidation. "That's what makes it fun, babe. I didn't think you'd be chicken." A flash of anger burned through Mia's apprehension as the barb struck home. She scowled but didn't argue further. They had all agreed to this. Backing out now was unthinkable, an unforgivable lapse in the unshakable code that bound their tight-knit clique. With a deep, steadying breath, Jesse tightened his grip on the heavy steel pipe he brought along and took the first step across the rickety boards that spanned a dry drainage ditch, leading his friends through the ominous archway and into the shadowed heart of the legendary Blackwood Carnival. An eerie, preternatural silence instantly enveloped them, seeming to smother all sound save for the crunch of their footsteps over the debris and litter strewn across the cracked concrete pathway. As they delved deeper into the heart of the carnival, the crumbling, decrepit facades of rides, game booths, and other attractions materialized from the gloom like ancient, condemned relics. A massive Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its motionless passenger baskets twisted into bizarre contortions and hanging askew like broken bodies from a rusty, skeletal scaffolding. Farther along, the gaping maws of dark rides and funhouses cleared from behind peeling facades adorned with lurid carnival imagery. Nathan, the youngest of the group at 15, visibly shivered, the cone of his flashlight beam bobbing with each tremulous motion. "This place gives me the total creeps." "You ain't kidding, little bro," Alex muttered with a grim chuckle as he swung his light over a weather-beaten sign proclaiming Tunnel of Torments $1. A clearing hellish face, frozen in a demented clear, seemed to follow their movements from within the murky shadows of the entrance. No one could disagree with Nathan's sentiment. The sense of silent menace and unnatural foreboding that hung over the abandoned carnival was palpable, a suffocating psychic miasma that seeped into their very marrow. The funhouse, its crazed facade a garish portrait of peeling clown figures and lurid colors, beckoned to them like a sinister temptress amid the turpitude, daring them to confront the madness that lurked within its dilapidated depths. "Let's check it out." Alex aimed the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight at the gaping maw of the entrance, illuminating a gauntlet of dangling mold-encrusted rubber monsters in garish murals. Though every instinct urged them to turn and flee, the thirst for danger, that potent cocktail of adrenaline and adolescent immortality, was a craving that could not be denied, driving them ever onward. One by one, they ducked through the rotted plywood doorway, surrounded by acrid smells, and descended into the swallowing darkness of the funhouse. The dank air was hookingly thick with the musty reek of mildew and decay, making it difficult to draw breath without coughing fits. Suddenly, a series of eerie, high-pitched giggling echoed all around them, Teld-like voices distorted into the mocking tones of demented imps by unseen acoustics. Instinctively, the 5 friends froze in their tracks, every hair raised in visceral terror at the unnatural sound. Is Is someone in here? Maya's tremulous voice barely rose above a whisper. No one dared speak further, their pounding hearts drowning out all other noise as they strained their senses against the smothering blackness surrounding them. The darkness itself seemed to throb with malign presence. As if in response to Mia's query, a warped, disembodied cackle tore through the gloom to pierce their minds like a rusted blade slashing at their sanity. Nathan yelped, stumbling backwards right into a cracked mirror mounted on the wall. But instead of his fearful reflection, the aged glass showed a twisted, deformed face with sunken pits for eyes and a maw-like grin stretched impossibly wide over shattered teeth in a grotesque parody of a smile. They barely had time to process this nightmarish apparition before the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. The very walls seemed to undulate and warp inward, closing in around them like the pulsating innards of a living creature digesting its prey. Blind panic detonated in their chests as they frantically cast about, seeking any escape from this madness. But the funhouse had decayed into a nightmarish labyrinth of ever-shifting chambers and corridors with no exit in sight. The sickening laughter echoed from all sides, legion mocking voices taunting their frantic terror as reality itself began dissolving around them. Heart pounding, sweat drenching his brow, Jesse spearheaded the frantic charge through the contorting passages of the funhouse, his steel pipe gripped in white-knuckled desperation. He could hear the ragged pants and whimpers of his friends as they blindly followed, propelled by the same primal drive for survival that had stripped away all reason, all rationale. Every turn led deeper into a realm of fresh horrors, corridors where the walls rippled and pulsed like raw, bleeding musculature, abruptly opening onto chambers filled with grasping shadows that seized them with icy tendrils, only to vanish as quickly as they'd struck. The pungent stench of decay enveloped them, accompanied by the deafening cacophony of that eerie, multi-tongued laughter that seemed to emanate from the very air, amplifying in thunderous waves of mockery. A piercing shriek sliced through the madness, momentarily freezing them in their tracks. Emma, scrambling to keep up from the rear, had been snatched bodily into the yawning, fanged maw of a reeking yellow corridor. One moment she was there, her pale face twisted in a ritus of terror, the next simply gone without a trace, swallowed completely by whatever unspeakable presence had summoned forth this realm of waking nightmare. Emma, Nathan's anguished wail shredded what little semblance of composure remained within their group. Tears streamed down his ashen cheeks, his knuckles white around the beam of the flashlight that pathetically illuminated their sealed fate. We have to go back, we can't leave her. Jesse's arm was like an iron vice around Nathan's bicep as he forcibly dragged the distraught boy onward. Grim truth battled with instinct, but he knew hesitation meant damnation. We can't, not if we want to survive this. The words were harsh, laced with bitter pragmatism, but he could see the harrowing understanding etching itself onto each of their faces. Emma, beautiful, vibrant Emma, was gone, lost to the monstrous being or force that held sway over this hell-spawned dimension, and her loss would be in vain if they faltered. With hollow determination, eyes vacant of emotion, they pressed onward in blind flight. No other course remained. What felt like an eternity of unrelenting terror and frantic endurance finally culminated with the shock of open, unobstructed space whipping across their sweet-streaked faces. They burst free of the funhouse's confines in a desperate heap of ragged gasps and trembling limbs to sprawl upon the cracked pavement of the midway, fully exposed to the eldritch spectacle that had consumed the Blackwood Carnival. But even the blessed reprieve of escape was cruelly ephemeral. A strangled cry tore itself from Mia's raw throat as she drank in the unfolding panorama of waking nightmare all around them. The once dilapidated hulks of rides and attractions had seemingly burst into a grotesque, animated travesty of their former cheerful selves. The merry-go-round's wooden horses pranced in frenzied arcs with demonic energy, their expressions twisted into snarling fangs and glaring hollow sockets where painted eyes had once delighted children. Nearby, the tilt-a-whirl's skeleton of rusted girders and frayed canopies had sprouted hooked barbs and talons, writhing amid a furious cyclone of torn canvas strips and scalding freon mist shrieking from riven cooling lines. Worst of all was the roller coaster, a gargantuan steel behemoth scorching across the interline of the fairgrounds. Now its tracks had convulsed into a snarled, tangled mass of razored metal girders accented with jutting fangs and buckled loops that reached outward like gnarled claws, groping hungrily for any stray victims. And amid this hell-spawned carnival sideshow, nightmarish humanoid shapes moved with singularly sinister purpose through the gloom. hunched, distorted things that skittered on twisted, malformed limbs with boneless alacrity. Their eyeless, mouthless faces were little more than sunken pits of inky shadow, yet they seemed to sense the prey that had wandered into their domain with ravenous prescience. What are those things? Maya's panicked whimper barely registered to Jesse's overwrought senses. All he could process was the palpable aura of dread and terror radiating from those undulating, stalking forms. Whatever they were, their sole purpose was to rend and defile in the most excruciating manner imaginable. He swallowed the acid lump of fear that burned in his throat. There was no more room for uncertainty or hesitation, only flight. "I don't want to find out, run!" hauling me up by the shoulders. He didn't spare a moment before pivoting and bolting in the opposite direction, not daring to look back as preternatural howls of rancid hunger and rage erupted in their wake. Without conscious thought towards navigation or destination, they fled blindly through the eldritch carnival's distorted, ever-shifting paths, haste by the gibbering spetters of their darkest, most primordial fears. Run, that's all he was capable of. Run, putting one foot in front of the other in an endless rhythm fueled by panting terror. Sheer visceral survival instinct. Where or for how long he couldn't process through the white noise of panic. At some point, the quality of the screaming darkness changed around them, growing more claustrophobic and humid with the reek of mold and decaying canvas. Gaudy light strains flickered through the gloom in a mad, unhinged carnival of color accompanied by rattling hoots and cries that defied any rational source. Then, without warning, Jesse's next stumbling stride met only empty air, sending him plunging headlong through tattered streamers and rancid folds of fabric to sprawl in a tangle of limbs upon a precarious hillock of debris and moldering carnival detritus. Gasping, he rolled over to find himself staring directly up into the distended, lightless eye of a bleached skull clearing from amid the constructed mound, just one component in a sprawling, grotesque effigy assembled from mutilated mannequins, desiccated animal carcasses, and countless other twisted, unidentifiable objects and viscera, all crudely lashed together in a looming, trembling mountain of decaying refuse. Petrified, Jesse scrambled backwards, nearly sliding off the churning expanse before steadying himself and regaining his bearings. They had somehow blundered into the hellish heart of the carnival's nightmare realm, a massive, cavernous sideshow tent that defied all sense of scale or boundaries. High overhead, the twisted effigy presided from amid what seemed to be a limitless ceiling, its disparate pieces shifting and separating like some malign fungal colony in constant cyclic growth. Below, the central ring and staging area stretched out in a deck of interwoven detritus and jagged metallic outcroppings encircled by rows of rusted balusters and iron cages. Within those perverse holding pens, the hunched, distorted, screaming shapes akin to those they had fled massed in drooling, snarling agitation, a grotesque vaudevillian chorus eagerly awaiting some unspeakable spectacle. "Welcome, children, to my grandest performance of all." The disembodied voice detonated around them like thunder, a rich, reverberating baritone that crawled down their spines like physical violation. As it spoke, a tall, slender figure descended from within the depths of the effigy itself atop a spiral slick trail fashioned from compacted detritus. Jesse's gorge rose, threatening to expel what little remained in his churning gut at the sight of the embodied presence now stalking towards them with a consummate shaman's theatrical gait. The Ringmaster was a waking nightmare rendered in decaying flesh and bone, an amalgam of man and pure defilement. His papery skin stretched taut over a gaunt, almost skeletal frame, painted in thick garish stripes of crimson and midnight black dyes that glistened with some caustic oily secretion. The tails of his weather-beaten Ringmaster's coat were fashioned from rotting Ringmaster's coat, tattered streamers, and sloughed flesh strips that writhed with morbid animation, as if infested by parasites. From beneath them sprouted a writhing tangle of limbs, talons, and featureless appendages, some chitinous, some ropey and organic, sprouted with constantly swiveling eyeballs and an obscene pular colio. A towering collar of spiked black fur surrounded his elongated features, framing a nightmarish visage dominated by a garish ruby veneering of serrated fangs jutting from jaw to crown in an exaggerated, fixed radius of a clear, "Do you like my little carnival?" Even at a whisper, the Ringmaster's voice rasped and grated like nails along bare bone. Wide arms festooned in dripping tattered fabric swept in a grandiloquent gesture, as if proudly presenting his domain. Panic set Jesse's heart racing with the peals of a muffled jackhammer. He took an involuntary step backward, only to find his retreat impeded by the cages and their coupons, hulking swaths of darkness surrounding them with rancid heat and bestial snarls that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. What do you want from us? His voice emerged as little more than an anguished croak of desperation. An eerie, cavernous chuckle rumbled forth from the ringmaster, a sound that grated across their nerves like rusted blades on an abattoir's bone saw. Want? The ringmaster's grinning maw split even wider, revealing row upon horrific row of fangs and distending to impossible proportions with each malformed syllable. Why, I simply want to entertain you. As any good showman would, you entered my domain of your own free will. Now you shall play by my rules. As he spoke those final, ominous words, a chill that existential dread prickled the hairs along Jesse's nape and caused his bladder to loosen. Some primal, ineffable part of his psyche had pierced the veil of numbing terror to glimpse the profane truth underlying this nightmare realm. The Blackwood Carnival was no mere funhouse of frights, no abandoned amusement park reclaimed by urban legions and malicious squatters. This place, this entity, was something far more ancient and insidious. A higher plane of reality given form through the suffering of those unfortunate enough to trespass upon its borders. And they had just become the latest participants in the ringmaster's unholy coterie of tormented souls, destined to fuel the cycle of depravity for all eternity. The hunched, howling shapes confined in the cages erupted into fresh paroxysms of slavering excitement as the ringmaster threw his arms wide, palms facing the heavens in a grotesque mockery of benediction. Join me in my revels, children, bear witness to the grand guignol delights that await those whose curiosity exceeds the boundaries of mortal terror. His final booming proclamation seemed to detonate reality itself around them as the fetor of decay and unholy energy swirled in a raging vortex. Debris rained down in choking clouds as the enclosing pens and cages began to undulate with purulent, viscous motion. Figures and extremities bubbled through the slick rusted bars as the very air began to putrefy. Jesse, Mia, and the others could only cling together with strangled cries as the ringmaster's grand finale threatened to engulf them in a waking apocalypse of pure, cosmic horror. His worst nightmares had only just begun their true defilement. Though Jesse strained with every fiber of his being, his mind could not process the unfolding cataclysm surrounding them with any coherent rationale. All semblance of the physical realm had dissolved into a roiling, kaleidoscopic maelstrom of sensory overload. Space itself seemed to dilate and contort with every grasping, triumphant utterance from the ringmaster's unholy maw. Behold my faithful carrowers. Behold the new performers destined to grace our carnival's myriad stages for all eternity. Each deafening syllable detonated through Jesse's consciousness like a thermobaric bomb, threatening to reduce his very psyche to ashes. He could feel the essence of his very self unraveling, stripped away by unholy frequencies of pure madness. Reality itself spiraled down into a towering cyclone that engulfed their huddled group, simultaneously compressing them into an infinitely dense singularity whilst rending them asunder at a subatomic level. Somewhere in the roaring vortex, those serrated fangs loomed impossibly vast, thin, minuscule, undulating through every scale of perception in cosmic hunger. A trillion iridescent claws groped inward seeking to seize them. A single, timeless moment stretched into infinity. Resisting the disintegration of his fragile mind, Jesse's overwrought consciousness became anchored on the pale, tear-streaked face of Mia. He focused every fiber of remaining will upon her terrified features, upon the memories of their blissful youth before this fateful night, upon anything that could anchor his dissolving soul against the predations of the ringmaster. Then, like a soap bubble bursting, the vortex imploded around them with a sudden disorienting sensation of kaleidoscopic vertigo. Jesse's senses slammed back into a solidity so abruptly that he doubled over, retching until his lungs burned with strain. When he managed to finally lift his gaze, they found themselves within a vast, geometrically impossible enclosure that seemed to spiral along multiple axes at once. Cyclopean stained glass panes formed the twisting, mirrored walls, depicting lurid scenes of cosmic evil and blasphemous revelries. Looming gargoyle faces glared down from dizzying heights adorned with blind, bubbling eyes and lolling tongues. Myriad suspended catwalks and platforms bridged the vertiginous space at every conceivable angle, interconnected by worn iron spiral staircases groaning with untold miasmas of despair beyond human comprehension. At the center of the dizzying chamber, a towering daze bathed in sickly energies seemed to contort in constant metamorphosis, one moment a sacrificial altar, The next is shuddering, falls outlined orifice, then reconstituting into a bone-littered cradle spilling putrescent ichor in pulsing waves. Lining those precarious outwalks and platforms massed thousands upon thousands of figures, some distended, fleshy giants with lidless eyes and maws lined in concentric rings of fangs. Others stunted and emaciated things traveling on all fours, their bodies mere chitinous catalogues of repulsive fetishes. In between lurked hosts of shifting, indescribable aberrations in which only fleeting, profane resemblances to the human form could be glimpsed. These were the harrowers, the true denizens that dwelled within the hellish dimensions of the Blackwood Carnival. Their guttural chants and hoots thundering in waves of rhythmic debasement upon witnessing the Ringmaster's arrival in their realm. Welcome, children, to the dominion of our sweet Fearia, mistress of excess and delight. The Ringmaster savored his syllables, as if the very words granted him unfathomable pleasures. Jessie felt Mia's convulsive shudder as she collapsed against him in the wake of that ominous appellation. Unbidden, fresh terrors flooded his sepses as his limited consciousness brushed against the true, cosmic, eldritch scale of the entity holding them wrapped. Look up in awe, feeble amusements, at the gestation of your new mistress. Their gazes were inexorably drawn to the centralized daze as its morphous entirety peeled back in a grotesque blossoming of sucking, hernicated folds. From the lurid crimson heart of the mass emerged something too ephemeral for sight, pregnant with festering, cosmic immensity, yet also intimately kin to the frailest, most gossamer vulnerability of the human soul. Jesse's vision tripled in disorienting fractures as his senses reeled away from the proximity of the force now issuing forth into their reality. Yet he also instinctively perceived that this gestating demonic seed embodied the ultimate source of the all-consuming despair, revulsion, and preternatural defilements that empowered the fevered visions of Fearia's dominion, a scintillant facet of the truest, unbound primordial chaos that ruled the outermost reaches of cosmic darkness before time and space contained any divinity or meaning. This unknowable, kaleidoscopic presence manifesting as a simultaneous extension and inverse of humanity's dream-spawned nightmares bored directly into the fabric of Jesse's fragile sentience, violating and corrupting from the inside out. An inner scream tore at the muted keening that now replaced his larynx, his mind rapidly disassembling into shuddering planes of euphoria and cataclysmic horror. The outpouring of Fearia's connectional matter began coalescing into semi-stubble shapes and masses, seeding manifestations fueled by the feverish adulations of the harrowers. Bulbous, glistening larvae emerged encrusted with ropey membranes and spiraling horns, all gestating within dripping, deciduous amniotic sacs. Alongside them wriggled masses of organic tubing concatenated into braidworks pulsing with obscene hunger and profane light. These foul-birthed things quickly engorged to prodigious sizes, anchoring themselves within the gelatinous, godwon matrix as development accelerated towards ever more terrifying permutations of existence. The larvae shed their viscera-opaque tusks to unfurl legions of segmented behemoths sporting proboscis nightmarishly adapted to rend the very fabric separating realities. Concurrently, the tubing became a sentient tapestry of clenching maws and casting orifices, spreading out in membrane waves that lashed and strangled the onlookers like some virulent offspring suddenly ravenous to invert its progenitors. Throughout it all, the monstrous carrowers shrieked and ululated their fervent prayers to their sweet Fearia, encouraging the hackle-fluff seeding to plunge on into ever-spiraling vortices of depravity and rapture. And at the core presiding over it all with taloned ubiquity, the Ringmaster reigned supreme as vector and vessel for this psychic apocalypse scouring reason from all creation. His towering stature fraternized into infinite replications both minuscule and mountainous, a singular entity seemingly overseeing every possible manifestation of this unfolding cataclysm. Jesse could feel his sanity fraying away to ether as nameless, blasphemous concepts too enormous for the human mind to encompass burrowed into the deepest, most sacrosanct recesses of his psyche. This was no mere spectacle of the debased and deranged filtered through a corrupted unconscious. This was a birth chamber into which an outside presence far more primal than hell itself was gestating, an interstitial space between dimensions where the raw, formless chaos that predated all ordered existence could breach into reality in its most delirium-fueling forms. Jesse's perspective fractured into a kaleidoscope of divergent realities, each vista more disturbing and visceral than the last as Fearia's birthing intensified. In one fragment, he witnessed the distended bulk of a fleshy embryonic leviathan swelling to immensity, its pulsating hides splitting open in gory sprays as regiments of smaller, ten-tailed horrors clawed their way to freedom, grobuns of birth matter trailing in obscene streamers. In another sliver of materialized pandemonium, forests of serrated bone feathers erupted from reeking pools of ichor to lash outwards, flaying everything in their path down to tattered meat streamers that fed swirling, carrion vortices of pitiless consumption. Still other shards reflected the weeping angles and gravity-betrayed perspectives of dimensions wholly incompatible with physical reality as they tore open to vomit cyclones of shrieking mouthworms eager to tunnel into fresh matrices for entropical seeding. Yet no matter from what distinct vector Jesse witnessed the ongoing, ever-escalating Fearia, an inescapable commonality wove through them all, the abject degradation and negation of everything recognizable as sane or sentient, replaced only by the rapturous extremities of sensual overload and obliterating anguish as the Ringmaster orchestrated this encroachment using their tormented psyches as raw fuel. It was only when his mind's eye turned inward to the spectacle of his own shrieking ego that the true depths of this eldritch conniption's virulence manifested most intimately. As layer by layer of Jesse's identity and soul essence peeled away like rotting veils of flesh, he found himself confronted by the ever-refining essence of his innermost self stripped naked before the profane vastnesses. There, radiating in brilliant revelation, burned the incandescent quantum of individuated sentience that made him a singular spark of illumination in the cosmos, a clarion pure note in the greater harmonics of spiritual existence. His ultimate defiance against oblivion, the sanctity that Fearia and her harrowers most hungered to profane and extinguish in agony. That inviolable refuge of his spirit stood radiant and alone against the tidal onslaught of eldritch conception matter voraciously devouring all other facets of his being. But in the thrall of Fearia's rapacious appetites, even this ultimate bastion of selfhood would eventually yield, mutated into just another profane breeding vessel through which more damned permutations of her Ringmaster's raptures could take purchase. Lingering fragments of Jesse's tattered consciousness could only look on in screaming awe as his incandescent spark finally rippled, distorting like a reflection on disturbed waters. Then, like the bursting of a viral spore exhaling plague winds from its husk, the sacred essence fractured outward in a silent shockwave to be subsumed within fioned, iridescent folds of unending nightmare. In the aftermath, only Jesse remained with any shard of fragmented psyche after the violations suffered during the Haxflow's birthing of Fearia's dominion. His perceptions and memories shuffled like a deck of painted nightmares by the fiery, unnameable psychic trial of cosmic defilement he had somehow endured. All around him, the colossal birthing chamber echoed only with wet sibilance, the pulsating succession of the impossibly vast and manifold new gestated horrors now drifting in stilled quiescence, their mutations of form and function myriad as the oceans. Like a forest of blasphemous, perpetually contracting orchids sculpted in bubbling bone spore and used viscera, the fruits of the eldritch insemination that had despoiled his soul billowed in serene, awaiting obscenities. Beyond their perimeters, the horrors had fallen into reverential silence, their depredations and howling hosannas momentarily stilled in abeyance. Somewhere, Jesse knew the Ringmaster himself must also be present, the shatterpoint of divergent realities that force had birthed through its ceaseless campaign against the cohesive integrity of ordered existence itself. Blinking sluggishly, Jesse attempted to focus his battered psyche solely upon regaining some baseline of sense and purpose to stave off total consumption by the obscene immensities now cradling what little spirit he had left intact. Impossible to perceive consciously, but instinctively understood, was the certainty that this latest unleashing of Fearia's conception matter upon reality was only a single depraved overture in an infinitely vaster, cyclical half-smoothie scored by the Ringmaster across every slipstream where sentient minds could suffer and have their divine insulations breached. Through the sacrificial agonies of all that encountered his carnival's warped dimensions, Jesse realized with mounting existential dread, the Ringmaster nurtured and shaped the monstrous gestations of Fearia itself, the primal incarnation of the very protogenia that had preceded and spawned this universe of seemingly immutable physical laws. And while those newly birthed horrors he bore witness to here represented incalculable vileness given manifestation, they were but one more step through an infinite progression of defiling iterations. Those psychogenic ordnance were seeded outward across the realities to take root in the spaces where hope, reason, and human potential resided, metastasizing within the fertile terrors of sentient minds via contagions of delirious inspiration. Through those echoing ripples in the cosmic warp stream of what could be visualized or conceived, Fearia's depraved reconfiguring of all matter and energy would thus propagate like a spiritually carried disease, until ultimately even the foundational physical constants would warp and putrefy into unrecognizable harbingers of eldritch chaos. Luminous hieroglyphs seared into Jesse's reeling perception like scar tissue formed by cosmic torment, the damned truth that Fearia's dominion, this birthing of irresistible entropic horror, was sustained through an infinite recursive loop of spiritual defilement and conception spread exponentially throughout all existence. The Ringmaster is the sadistic conduit fueling that self-devouring cycle of inverted creation with the stolen vestiges of its hapless performers' very souls. Buckling under the weight of such unfathomable comprehension, Jesse felt himself teetering on the precipice separating the remnants of his human sentience from the psychic annihilation and metamorphosis they borne witness to, an emptying void where he should have felt fear, loathing, or any other form of sense or recognition consumed him instead. Some instinctual imperative compelled his raw consciousness to reach outward, connecting with those pale, svelte hands and slender wrists dangling in his peripheral vision. Mia, no memory or image of her gentle face remained as a touchstone, only the vestigial neurological imperative to cling to those physical anchors fleetingly recognizable as kin while the ultimate abyss of utter ego yawned before him. Focusing all the fortitude of his tattered soul upon those one extremities, Jesse somehow exerted the last tattered limits of corporeal will undegraded by Fearia's unholy conception pressures. The searing displacement of sudden translation overcame him for what felt like a dimensional eternity as his very essence scattered. Then, in a violent slipstream counter-harmony to the infinite ingressing of eldritch pandemonies, Jesse expelled every quantum of defiled psychic residue still bound within his depleted spirit like a physical fracturing open a spindrift channel piercing back into the mortal reality he'd once called home. Figuratively and literally, it was this final desperate act of existential severance that allowed his scorched and mutilated consciousness to ricochet with screaming momentum along the precipice of death, and miraculously back into the corporeal vessel that was his ravaged physical form. At last, after aeons flickering amid the outer abysses and untempered conception at the outer reaches of cosmic extremity, Jesse's essence detonated back into flesh and bone reality with the catastrophic impact of a steel meteorite striking glass. His shredded body jackknifed with explosive force as every synaptic receptor fired in mute agony. His jaws gaped open in a soundless scream of visceral torment that sprayed bloody aerosolized foam born of shredded throat and vocal cords. Jesse's limbs convulsed like a marionette, with its strings being severed as the shock of essence translation tore his mortal matrix asunder in cataclysmic reintegration. A final wild spasm sent his contorting form tumbling over and over down the crumpled black asphalt embankment below the Blackwood Carnival's archway like a ragdoll's. With a sickening crunch of shattered bone impacting sun-baked earth, Jesse's macabre tumbling at last found terminal stillness in the dry, overgrown ditch. For long moments, only the hiss of humid autumn wind through the cracked archway's wrought iron filigree disturbed the crushing silence. Then, with a muffled gurgle of agony, Jesse's shattered rib cage shuddered under the forces of his ragged insulations, lungs desperate for precious oxygen as his first panicked bout of life clung to him once more, no matter how tenuous. Staring unseeingly at the sight of his ruined form lay partially obscured amid the weeds. One final synaptic spark of awareness flickered in the smothering depths of Jesse's clarated psyche, some basic recognition of whom and what he was. A young man not long beyond the cusp of adolescence. At one point, a soul brimming with potential before this curse had tainted him. And as that final pearl of identity dissolved like ash upon the waters of his shattered shell, so too did the last fragments of Jesse's sanity dissolve back into the blissful oceans of madness and perpetual nightmare waiting his anguished rebirth.